Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Samachay. Today's daf is sponsored in honor of Esther's birthday. To my big sister, thank you for introducing me to the Shiur. I'm so proud of you. Many happy and healthy returns from your brother. Okay, we are going to get started with we're going to continue the topic of yesterday's daf. We have the issue of Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis. Whether when somebody sells something, do they sell it generously or sparingly? Is it going to include more things than you would think? Again, we're not talking about what exactly is included, but in a case where I left for myself a pit, do I leave a path for myself, or do we say, no, if I sold you completely, and then I would have to purchase for myself a path? That would be Rabbi Akiva, who says, according to the rabbis, no, I'm going to sell, but only what is good for me. I'm not going to sell and not allow myself an access route. So we're going to see right now is how did the rabbis later paskin? So we'll start with a machloket in the time of the Tanaim, and this is how a lot of sugyot develop. Then we get to the first generation of Moraim, Rav and Shmuel. From there, we're going to jump to Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. Okay, perhaps I'll preface this. This reminded me of Daf Nun Hey, which was not so long ago. Daf Nun Hey, you might remember, we had the sugya of Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. There was a case where Rav Huna had bought land, and then it was from a Gentile, someone else had done a chazaka on the land. It was in that in-between stage, if you recall. The money was given, there was no chazaka done yet, and therefore someone else came. They deemed the land ownerless based on Shmuel, and Rav Huna ended up losing his property. And he went to Rav Nachman's court and said, is this really the case? And Rav Nachman ends up ruling against Rav Huna. And Rav Huna even says, well, if you're ruling like Shmuel, you should rule like Shmuel all the way, and then you should... I'm sorry, if you're going to rule like Rav, you should rule like Rav all the way. I'm sorry, it was Shmuel. And then he says, oh, well, on that issue, I hold like you, who holds like Rav. And he basically gets him messed up. And Rav Nachman rules against Rav Huna. Now, what's important to understand here is a little bit of the history and the way who holds like who and what the general approaches are. So Rav Huna, our sugya is going to start off with Rav Huna quoting Rav. And Rav Huna in general, Rav Huna was second generation. He was a student of Rav. And he was really meant to be the Rosh Yeshiva after Rav died, but Shmuel ends up taking over, and he doesn't become Rosh Yeshiva until Shmuel dies. But he's really up there with Rav and Shmuel. Rav Nachman is already like second/third generation, and not as prominent as Rav Huna is in terms of knowledge. However, he's married to the daughter of the exilarch, and because of that, he becomes the judge in the house of the exilarch. And because of that, as you're going to see in our sugya, first of all, in that sugya, he ends up ruling against Rav Huna, and Rav Huna accepts it, even though Rav Huna is really greater than Rav Nachman, but he ends up accepting Rav Nachman's judgment. And Rav Nachman is often of the school of thought of Shmuel. He's often quoting Shmuel much more than Rav. So we have Rav Huna who goes with Rav, we have Rav Nachman who goes with Shmuel. And even though Rav Huna is greater than Rav Nachman becomes a ruler in the court. He has a lot of court cases, and because of that, we're going to see, the Gemara is going to say it explicitly today, that Rav Huna is even going to say, I defer to you on these issues because you have a lot more experience. And that's a fascinating concept where somebody might have more knowledge, but the other person has a lot more experience in the court, and therefore they end up, and even the one who's more knowledgeable even concedes, okay, just like in Daf Nun Hey, and that's why I wanted to compare it, because we learned it not very long ago. There's the same thing going on here, which is that Rav Huna ends up disagreeing with Rav Nachman, which they often do because they each follow different schools of thought. Rav Huna going like Rav Nachman going like Shmuel. And yet, when it comes to ruling, Rav Huna is willing to defer. And it shows a lot of strength on his part, that he's willing, and we wish more leaders of our time would do this, willing to defer even though he disagrees with him on these issues, because he recognizes that Rav Nachman has a lot more experience in monetary law. And by the way, this fits with other things we've seen in the Gemara, that when it comes to Rav and Shmuel, we paskin like Rav when it comes to Isser v'Heter issues, things that are forbidden or permitted, and we paskin like Shmuel when it comes to rulings. He was also an expert in judgment. So, and Rav Nachman is in the school of thought of Shmuel, so it also kind of fits. So let's start without more introduction. We'll start our daf. Itmar, Rav Huna amarav halacha kedivrei chachamim. So Rav Huna says in the name of Rav, as I said, that's who he usually holds by, and he says the halacha is like chachamim. So basically what we want to get here right now is Rav. Okay, Rav Huna is important later, but right now Rav holds like the rabbis. Okay, who says mocher ba'ayin ra'a mocher. you're going to end up leaving yourself, right? Depending on if we go with the first case in the Mishnah, if I left myself the bore, I'm going to leave myself an access route. Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Shmuel halakha ki Rabbi Akiva. Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says in the name of Shmuel that we paskin like Rabbi Akiva. So Amar, who says obviously the opposite. Amar le Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba le Rav Huna. So Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba now goes to Rav Huna and says, "Are you sure Rav held this way? Has zimnin sagin amarita kamei de Rav hilchata ki Rabbi Akiva." There were lots of times where I said before Rav, the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, velo Amar li velo midi, and he didn't say anything. So he must have agreed with me. So how can you say he holds like the rabbis? So Amar le hechi tanite. He says, "Well, what was your version of the Mishnah?" To which he says, Amar le ipcha tanina. I said the opposite. Now he obviously didn't say the words. I said the opposite. But what happened was Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba had to confuse who said what. So when he said before Rav that the halacha is this way, like Rabbi Akiva, but it was like his version of Rabbi Akiva, which was actually our version, the rabbis. And that's why Rav didn't say anything, because Rav agreed with him. But that's why Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba was confused about what Rav held, because he had misquoted who said what, and therefore Rav Huna says to him, Amar le, mishum hachi lo amar lecha velo midi. Well, that's why he didn't say anything, because you had the wrong version of the Mishnah. Amar le Rabina, right? It teaches you, I'm trying to think about what exactly the lesson is here, but it's a lesson in also being careful that when you, not to infer from, first of all, from someone's lack of reaction, it doesn't necessarily mean that they agree with you. And also you have to know exactly what you said and not to confuse who said what. And that could also affect this. Amar le Ravina le Rav Ashi. So the first thing we're going to do with this machloket Rav and Shmuel, okay, after getting to the small aside, did Rav really held that way? What about his lack of reaction to Rav Yirmiyah, which we resolved? Now we're going to talk about, Ravina is going to say to Rav Ashi, Lema azdu l'tamayu. Let us suggest, which is often rejected, and here it will be, let us suggest that they are consistent within their approaches. Okay, and the Gemara is going to later treat this a little bit more like, why do we need to say it here if it already said it there, even though it didn't really introduce it in that way, but basically saying, oh, we have another machloket Rav and Shmuel, which is based on the exact same thing. And then they're going to say, not necessarily. De Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel. Here comes Rav Nachman, who I said is going to come in. He holds like Shmuel in this case. As I told you, he usually holds like Shmuel. And here we're talking about brothers who split up an inheritance. Now, if you might remember, we've had this big discussion later, not later, in other sugyot, about when people split up an inheritance, are they viewed as if one purchased from the other, and therefore regular laws of purchasing apply, or not? Or are they considered like heirs? Okay, and is it a different kind of track? Well, we're going to assume right now, and it seems like no one really disagrees with this, that both Rav and Shmuel view the heir as a purchaser. So therefore, we can put in laws of purchasing, okay? Meaning, if achim shechaku, okay, these brothers divide up the property according to Shmuel. Now remember, Shmuel held like Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says, mocher ba'ayin yafa. So what if these two brothers split up in property? We're going to have a few kind of issues that would come up. Ein lahem lo derech zel zeh. Let's say one got the pit and the other one got the house. Now, if in order to get to the pit, you have to go through the house, so did the brother who gets the pit have an access route through the house, right? The father obviously was able to get to his pit without a problem. He owned both the house and the pit, but when the brothers divided up and they're considered as if they purchased, so Shmuel says they don't have a derech zel zeh. One can't go through the property of the others to get there, okay? Which means, right, that's Shmuel, halakha Rabbi Akiva, mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher. Because one basically who sold it to the other, sold, right? In other words, each one got the complete part. And therefore the other one would have to, the one who has the bore would have to get an access route through the house. Okay? So, because it was completely belonging to the other. Vilo, and it's not just a derech, lo sulamot zalzeh. If one lives upstairs and the other owns the butt downstairs and the courtyard, well, then you can't put your ladder there to get upstairs, even though how else are you going to get upstairs unless you purchase a route? Or lo amatamai, lo chalonot zalzeh. If you remember, by the way, we learned this in the beginning of the Masechet. This whole thing was quoted on Daf Zayin. If one wants to block the window of the other, they can. Okay, and lama mayim zalzeh. And if one has a field and the water channel was in one field, and from that water channel, the father would water the other field, but now the brother owns that other field, you can't bring the water from that water channel and channel it into the other property. And be careful with these because these are set halachot. That's what they said in the name of Shmuel. That's what Rav Nachman said. Rav Amal yesh lahen. And Rav says, what do you mean? Of course they have a derech. Because mocher b'ayin yafa mocher. They gave generously to the other. And if you give generously, I'm sorry. Rav says, sorry, I said it wrong. Rav says, we hold like the rabbis, mocher b'ayin ra'a mocher, right? And one is not going to give up his part of the property, right? In other words, I'm a brother. Okay, let's say sister. I get part of it. If I get the bore and I'm going to give you the house, I'm not going to give you the house without leaving part for myself. Mocher b'ayin ra'a mocher, right? I'm going to give you your part as if I'm selling it to you, but I'm going to keep part of it for myself because I'm not going to make it inconvenient for myself. So that's Rav. So basically, the Gemara said, Ravina said, why don't we suggest that this is the exact same logic? And therefore, okay, I'm adding words because of the way the Gemara is going to relate or the way they're going to respond to this, which is, and then why do you really need to say both? It's all one and the same thing, to which they're going to say tzricha. No, you needed both these arguments. Now, both that in our Mishnah, they have a machloket, and also here they have a machloket because yesh me'ina ba'ahi. If you just had this case of the inheritance, you would have thought ba'ahi ka'amar Rav, that maybe Rav only said mocher b'ayin ra'an, the brother kept a path for himself or a space in the courtyard to put his ladder or all those things. Mishum da'amar le be'inan l'meidarbe ki hechi didaru be'ahavati. Because he said, I'm coming in place of my father. If my father lived like this, then I should be able to live like this. In other words, since this was all one property to begin with, and I'm just taking my father's place, it's true, I'm giving up 50% of it, but not in a way that I can't live like my father lived. And in fact, it's a pasuk to support this reading. As we know, it says, it's a pasuk in Tehillim, which says, in place of the father, the sons will be, meaning the sons are supposed to live exactly as the father did. So if there was a water channel from there watering my field, then I should be able to get it. And maybe Rav only said it in that case, and you wouldn't necessarily be able to say, oh, from there we can derive to our case. Now, in the end, it's true in our case as well, but you wouldn't have been able to learn it from here. Aval baha, because you might have thought then in the sale case, a regular sale case, maybe you would agree with Shmuel. The mocher b'ayin yafa mocher, and really in the sale, one would be willing to give up their rights. And according to that exact same logic, we're now going to go the reverse. Itmar baha, if we had it just in a sale case, baha ka'amar Shmuel, that's when Shmuel would say, oh, mocher b'ayin yafa, gives up his rights. Ava beha, but in the case of the heirs, you might say, based on what we just said a minute ago, ema modi leila Rav. Maybe Shmuel would agree with Rav that when it comes to the brothers, each brother wants to live exactly as the father lived, and therefore they're clearly not going to give up the rights to the ladder, to the window, to all those things, and therefore tzricha. That's why in the end you need both, because you can't necessarily have learned one from the other. Now we get back to Rav Nachman and Rav Huna, and this is what I started in the beginning of the Shiur. Amalei Rav Nachman le Rav Huna. So if you recall, let's just go back. Rav Nachman holds like Shmuel. Well, we saw him in the brother case, okay? We assume he holds that way also by us, because in the end, even though they said they could have been different, in the end they say, though, it is really all the same. Even though you couldn't have learned one from the other, it's still the same. So Rav Nachman holds like Shmuel, and Rav Huna holds like Rav. So now we have an interesting conversation, which again, hard to imagine you would see this going on today, unfortunately. Maybe definitely something we should strive for. Rav Nachman and Rav Huna. Rav Nachman comes to Rav Huna because again, Rav Huna was greater than Rav Nachman really. And he says to Rav Huna, is the halacha like us, meaning me and Shmuel, or is the halacha like you, and you in the plural, meaning you and Rav? Amar le, and Rav Huna says, in fact, the halacha is like you. each one kind of giving into the other, right? Saying, let's talk about it. Not just instead of saying, I hold this way and you hold that way and let's go our separate ways. But no, they try to kind of work together. So Rav Nachman says, do we hold like you or do we hold like me? And Rav Huna says, oh, actually, we hold like you. Because you are close to the gate of the Reish Galuta, which means the gate is where the courts were. There's a lot of judgments and rulings there, and you have a lot more experience than I do. Because you have a lot more experience in monetary law specifically, we're going to hold like you in this case. And even though I disagree with you, I'm deferring to your opinion. Okay, and then we're almost at the end of the sugya. We now have one last issue to bring up. This is all about a sale from me to you of either I sold you the house or I sold you the board, right, and kept the board, or I sold you the board, kept the house. Those are the two cases in our Mishnah. And the question here becomes, again, debate between the Tanaim. Do we say that mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher, which is Rabbi Akiva, or do we say mocher ba'ayin ra'ah? Do I have to buy myself an access route, or do you have to buy an access route, depending on the situation? What do we do? But that's when there's me and you, and I'm selling to you. And then there's a question, am I leaving for myself? Am I giving more generously? But what if I'm selling to two different people? I sell one the house and one the board. Or in this case, we're going to see a different scenario, which is another case where you need an access route, which is Shnei Batim Zelifnim Mizeh. We have two houses, one is inner, one is outer. The inner one has to pass through the outer house. Now, it's the same idea where someone needs an access route to the other. Shneim b'mechel, shneim b'matana, whether I either gifted to both of them or I sold to both of them. Now, in this case, there's a case where there's me and you, so there's a reason why I might prefer to either keep more for myself or I might prefer to be generous and give more to you. But when it's me to two people, I don't have any reason to prefer one to the other. So there'd be no reason I would be mocher ba'ayin, right? That there would be a machloket about this. We would assume always that each person gets what they purchased, and that's it. I wouldn't be giving one more than the other. So ein lahem derech zal zeh. So one cannot pass through the house of the other, particularly even though they're saying in both directions. What we really mean is the person in the inner house can't get through to get out to through the other house unless they purchase a path. Kol shekain, and all the more so. So either, okay, what we're having here is they're both equal. Either I sold to both of them or I gave a gift to both of them. Now, what if I sold to one and gave a gift to the other? Now, the assumption is, and one could argue, but the assumption of the Gemara is if I sold it to someone, I might be more stingy about things. But if I gave a gift to someone, you generally give a gift generously. Now, if I gave a gift to two of you and one house to one and one to the other, well, I can't say I gave to one more generously than the other, and therefore each one just gets their house, no access route. But what if I gave one a gift and one a sale? So it depends which one, right? There's the inner that wants to go through the outer, and there's the outer that doesn't want to let the inner in. So kol shekain, all the more so, they're going to say, if the chitzon was b'matana and the pnimi was b'mecher. If the outer one got it as a gift and the inner one got it as a sale, of course then the inner one cannot go through the outer, because the assumption is the gift was given more generously, and therefore, of course, I gave the outer one all the rights to the house without giving the inner one any rights to walk through. And also, even right now, they're going to think if the inner person got it as a gift, they thought to say, and whenever it says they thought to say, we're going to reject it. They thought to say even in that case, because again, two people, it doesn't matter. Even if I was to give more generously the gift one, I still didn't give them an access route because I sold the house to the other person and they can't go through. But the Gemara rejects this one and says, Vilohi, this is not the case. Because based on a Mishnah, we're going to read in a few dapim. Milotnan, does it not say, Bamid Varim Amurim? When do we say this whole thing about that you're gonna, that, you know, mocher, the whole machloket we've had, mocher ba'ayin yafa ra'ah, b'mochel, aval, in a sale, aval b'noten matana, if you're giving a gift, noten et kulan, you clearly are giving generously. So even if you say mocher ba'ayin ra'ah in a sale, when it comes to a gift, you're giving generously. And therefore, everyone will agree that when you give a gift, you give it generously. And therefore, so if I gave two people, the inner person I gave it as a gift, the outer person I sold to, the inner person I obviously gave it as a gift, including an access route. And then that one case, we would have a case where I gave to two different people, and yet we'd still say mocher b'ayin yafa, and according to everybody even, because a gift is different than a sale. Now we're going to start a new Mishnah. If you remember, the first Mishnah was mocher habayit. Does it include the roof, the yitzia, right? The different rooms. Now we're going to talk about what items in the house. You sell a house, usually it doesn't include the furniture and all sorts of things. Does it include the front door? Is that considered furniture or not? Right? You would think it would be a bit strange to take the front door with you. So, mocher habayit, machar tadelet. Okay, few, the house, the door is included. However, loat maftech, not the key. This is a little bit tricky. What exactly do we mean by the key? Okay, the key is, we're going to see that there's different types of keys. There's keys that are set in the door. There's keys that are not really set in the door. Okay, their keys obviously were a little different than nowadays. Either which way, we're going to say it doesn't include a key. Okay, because a key, the door, as kind of you can figure, doesn't really come out very easily. It's really kind of set in there, where even if a key is part of the door, it still comes out easily. Some think that we're talking here also that perhaps the key, okay, and we're going to talk about this in a little while, which is these are things that serve the house. Okay, you need the key to get into the house. It's a little bit strange. You're not going to get the key. What it means here is that perhaps the key could be used in other houses as well. Perhaps it's like a master type key, in Israel, there's these FSFS keys, that you can use to open many doors. And therefore, the assumption is I wasn't planning to leave it with you because I wanted to take it with me and use in my new house. So we'll see. We're going to talk about this and try to figure out a little bit later kind of what key it is, although it won't be 100% clear from the Gemara what we mean. Machar machteshet kfu'ah. Okay, we're going to have this is not. This is not. You included in it the machteshet kfu'ah v'lo mitaltelet. Okay, this is the, I'm trying to remember. Oh, right, this is the mortar, just confusing the mortar and the millstone. This is the mortar and not the mitaltelet. Now, there's different kinds of mortars, and we're going to talk about them also as we go on. There's ones that were set in the ground, kind of glued into the ground, with some sort of material, or they were sometimes dug into the ground, okay, where you would take something, it was a big bowl type of thing where they would crush everything in it. So sometimes they would just create it from something in the ground. Either which way, this is either that kind or that kind. The main thing is it's kvu'ah, it's set in the ground. So that's included because it serves the needs of the house, right? The household needs are to make food. It's just something people did in their house. And it's also set in the ground. But if it's a movable one, it's not stuck to the ground, then it's not included. Machar to itzrovil avaloa tekelet. These were parts we saw other sugiyot, which is the itzrovil is, again, now we're talking about a millstone. They would grind the wheat generally into flour. And there, again, this was the bottom part that goes into the ground. There's a bit of a debate what part exactly all these pieces are. I don't want to get into all the details, but not the kelet, which is perhaps the place where they would pour all the grains into before they ground them. Again, it's an upper part, which is also movable. The loat tanur v'loat kirayim, the oven and the burner, those are not included. Bizman she'amar lo hu v'chomasha b'tocho. But if you said, and this sometimes people do this, they sell a house and they say, oh, you're getting everything in the house. I'm selling it all to you. It's all included. Then obviously, turning now to Amud Bet, all of these items are now going to be included in the sale because you said everything's included. Okay, so if you didn't say everything's included, the Mishnah has very clear rules. Things that are attached to the ground that serve the house, those are included. Things that are not attached to the ground are not. To which the Gemara immediately says, Lema manitin delo Rabbi Meir. Now, lema is usually, what did I tell you earlier today and many, many other times, rejected. In this case, this will be rejected and then reinstated. So it's a bit of an exception. Lema manitin delo Rabbi Meir. Why don't we suggest then our Mishnah doesn't follow Rabbi Meir? De'i Rabbi Meir. If you want to say the Mishnah holds like Rabbi Meir, ha'amal, he says in a different sugya, and we're going to see it in Ayin, machar et hakerem, if you sell a vineyard, machar tashmishei kerem. everything that serves that vineyard is included. So anything that's used in that vineyard is included in the sale, which seems to mean even things that are detached from the ground. And then Rabbi Meir would say, well, the oven, all the parts of the millstone and the mortar and the upper part, all those should be included. The key, everything, because they serve the house. To which they say, afilu tema Rabbi Meir, no. You could say, like Rabbi Meir, hatam kvia hachalo kvia. Perhaps in the kerem case, we were talking about that maybe the tashmishe kerem are things that are attached to the ground. And the things we're talking about here are not things that are attached. And maybe that's the distinction. And then we could say that even, right, that again, if they're set and part of the house, they'll be included. And if they're not, they're not. And Rabbi Meir might say the same thing. If they're part of the kerem, they'll be included. They're tashmishe kerem that are detached, though, and movable, maybe they're not included. To which they say you can't read the Mishnah that way. Why not? Because hamaftech, and I told you, we're going to get back to what kind of key we're talking about. They assume right now that there are different kinds of keys, as we said. And hamaftech dumia de delet katane. Ma delet de kvia, af maftech de kvia. They're assuming right now, and you have to wonder why they are assuming this, but that because they put delet opposite maftech, it must be that the maftech is not included, even though it might be similar to the door, which is, and maybe, as I said, unclear what we mean. Maybe this means this is a key that's specifically used for this door only, not a master key or a key that could be used anywhere. But this key is specifically for this door. And yet it's not included in the sale. And then you can't say Rabbi Meir matches this. Now, why did they think this? Perhaps they think it because the Mishnah distinguished in the case of the mafteshet between a kavua and not kavua, right? One that's attached to the ground, one that's not. In a key, they didn't say that. So it could be that what they're saying is because it didn't say one that is, one that isn't, they must mean all maftechot are not included, no matter what, even if they're fixed in the door and they're or perhaps that means unique for this door and only work in this door. It's still not included. Why? Because the author of the Mishnah thinks that anything that can be taken out easily, right? You could have something attached, but it could be detached very easily. And that's the story with a key, right? It's not like a door that's very heavy and it's very hard to detach, but a key is very easy to move. So because it's easy to take out, it's not going to be included in a sale. And then that can't match Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir clearly is saying anything that serves this vineyard particularly, which would be like this key, which serves this door, would be included, and therefore elam chuvarta matnitin delo ke Rabbi Meir. So therefore, in the end, they say, you're right. Our Mishnah really doesn't hold like Rabbi Meir. Now we're going to move to a Braita. The Braita is going to be very similar to the Mishnah with a few minor differences. A little bit elaboration, things that weren't mentioned in our Mishnah, and a little bit of disagreement. And on that point of disagreement, we're going to focus. Hamochir tanu Rabbanan. So the Braita says, Hamochir tabayit machar tadelet. So far, same thing. You sell a house. It includes the door. Ve'et haneger ve'et haman'ul. The neger is the bolt. The man'ul is the lock. Ava lo et hamaftech. So we have two added things here: the neger and the man'ul, but not the maftech, not the key. So it doesn't disagree, it just adds. We don't know what the owner of the Mishnah would have said about the neger and the man'ul, because those are things that are more set in the door. Maybe you could claim they're attached to the ground. The bolt is part of the door. Okay. Here comes the big difference. And now we start talking about a chakuka and a kfua. I mentioned there were two types. And those two types, I said, were all included in that one case in the Mishnah, where the Mishnah said, if you sell a house, it includes any kind of machteshet that's in the ground, whether it was a machteshet already, you created it, and then it was attached to the ground, you cemented it in, or a machteshet, mortar that you etched, you engraved from, or I'm trying to think of the word, but you basically hollowed out something in the ground, you hollowed out a stone, and you created a mortar like that. Either which way, it's included in the sale because it's attached to the ground. The Braita distinguishes between a chakuka, which is the one that was hollowed out while it was in the ground. That's considered like the ground. Avalot hakfu'ah, and that's going to be part of the sale, but not one that was separate from the ground, created, constructed as a vessel, and then attached to the ground. Because even though right now it's got glue, cement, something, you could detach it and it's really not considered part of the ground. And that's going to be our big issue for the rest of the shiur. Okay, the rest of this braita is the same, which is the itzrobil, but not the kelet, which is again the bottom millstone and the upper part of the millstone. The bottom being attached is part of it. The one that's above, the upper movable part, is not part of the sail, not the oven, not the kirayim, and not the rechaim. This is added, not, here we mean a hand and a millstone. Rabbi Eliezer Omer. Okay, now the Braita continues and adds a different opinion, which we didn't have in the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with the Tanakh in this Braita and says anything attached to the ground is included in, is like it's the ground. This, by the way, sounds like our Mishnah. Okay, because, and some people say, there's a bit of a deliberation about this. Most people say that Rabbi Eliezer is the Tana of our Mishnah, because that's exactly what our Mishnah says. If it's attached, it doesn't mean if it was a vessel and then attached, right? Doesn't mean, it doesn't matter if it was hollowed out from the ground. Either which way, it's attached to the ground, it's part of the sail. Bisman sha'amar lo, this is exactly the same line in our Mishnah. But if it was specified, this is only if nothing was specified and I just said I'm selling you a house. But if I said I'm selling you the house and everything in it, then obviously it's going to include any movable property. Ben kachu ben kach, but no matter what, whether I said everything's included or didn't say everything's included, lo machar lo etabol velo etadut velo etayitzia. And this seems to be what our Mishnah is holding also, because our Mishnah didn't say that line in the previous Mishnah when it talked about these items. So no matter what, though, if I say it's including everything that's in the house, not things that are considered not part of the house at all, like we discussed in the previous Mishnah, the pit, the cistern, and the yitzia, which was this extra added kind of room that we talked about. Okay, now we're going to go off on a tangent. We're going to talk about halacha of mikvah. Okay, seems totally unrelated. In a minute, we'll see the connection. If I build a mikvah, has to be from water, or not if I build it, but any mikvah has to be from water that's rainwater that isn't called mayim she'uvim. What is mayim she'uvim? Mayim she'uvim is water that was collected in a vessel. So if I collect water in something that is, and that's going to be the whole deliberation, what is called a vessel? If it's collected in a vessel, then I can't use it as water for the mikvah. Okay, this creates a major problem. This is why constructing mikvaot is quite expensive in a process, because you can't just collect water from somewhere and bring it to the mikvah. It has to be, okay, now we're going to see right now, well, what they would do is, right, let's say you had a lake and you wanted to bring the water from the lake into, now water in the lake obviously is in, right, it's in the lake, but the lake is the ground. So if it's in the ground, that's fine. If it's in a vessel, it's a problem. Now a vessel is usually something that's not attached to the ground. So what if I have, okay, Tanu Rabbanan, the bright, this is actually a Tosefta. It's a Tosefta in Mikvaot. Sinor shachakeko ulevasof kavao poselet mikvah. If I have a pipe that I basically, right, created a pipe and then I attached it to the ground. Now, that means it was first a vessel because I created it in a way that it could, hold water in it. Right, a pipe, even though you wouldn't exactly think of it as a vessel, but because it can hold water, it's a vessel. And then I attach it to the ground, that disqualifies a mikvah. So if I put a pipe in and pipe the water in, which would be the easiest way to do it, and much cheaper, right? Well, I can't do that because it was a vessel first, and now I attach it to the ground. Now you see the connection already, because we're distinguishing between vessels that were vessels first and then attached to the ground, which in the Braita, they said that's not included in a sale, versus something that we're going to see right now, if something was in the ground already, or I put it in the ground not as a vessel, okay, I put something in the ground like a big, something, or more likely I again hollowed out some stone in the ground, and then, right, so it was already attached to the ground, and then I hollowed it out, while it was attached to the ground, I made it into this pipe. Then it's not a vessel because it's attached to the ground at the moment it was created. And that would eino posela tamikvah. So you would have to basically create it while it's attached to the ground, which is obviously much more complicated. And that's the way we could get water to the mikveh in a kosher manner, according to the Tosefta. To which the Gemara says, and here's the big line that's going to raise a whole big question, Mane, who is this like? Lo Rabbi Eliezer velo Rabbanan. This does not follow Rabbi Eliezer's position, and it does not follow the rabbi's position. Now, the Gemara doesn't know, okay, someone said this statement, this is not Rabbi Eliezer, not the rabbis, and they want to know, hey, Rabbi Eliezer, which Rabbi Eliezer are we referring to? Now, since this is our sugya that we've been discussing, must be Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah. So, Ilem are Rabbi Eliezer, our Braita, sorry. Ilem are Rabbi Eliezer debayit, if it's Rabbi Eliezer, it's the topic of our Mishnah, but appears in the Braita, which is, again, what did he say? Anything attached to the ground is like the ground. Doesn't matter if it was created first and then attached or not created, not attached. When it comes to a sale, all those are considered attached to the ground, which means they'll all be included in the sale. And that would make sense that would go against the position in the Tosefta, which distinguished and said, no, if it was first a vessel and then attached to the ground, that's not considered attached to the ground, because attached to the ground would be great. That would work, but it doesn't work. So that sounds perfect. The problem with this, by the way, besides we're going to have a different problem, the problem is it says it's lo Rabbi Eliezer v'lo Rabbanan. Now, the Gemara doesn't relate at all to the rabbis, because then it would actually match the rabbi's position. Perhaps at this stage, the Gemara thinks maybe the rabbi's position, it doesn't match with some rabbi position somewhere else. We'll see. Eventually, we'll get to a better answer, which is going to not match either opinion mentioned in the source, not the rabbis, not Rabbi Eliezer, and that's going to make sense. I'm just putting aside that there's a bit of an issue here, because if you say this, then the rabbis would actually match up perfectly with the Tosefta, and that's not the case, because the Gemara, right, that wouldn't work, because the Gemara said it's not Rabbi Eliezer, not the rabbis. But I'm putting that aside, because right now they seem to be focusing just on first the Rabbi Eliezer. Let's just find Rabbi Eliezer. So if you want to say it, it's Rabbi Eliezer debayit. Now, Ilema also means we're going to reject this. Dilma hainu tama, it could be different there, because you're comparing a sale and mikvah, and sale has different criteria. For example, right, you could say, when it comes to a sale, Rabbi Eliezer saval, mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher. Rabbanan savre mocher ba'ayin ra'a mocher. Perhaps the basis of the machloka between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis has nothing to do with, do we view a vessel that was created and then attached to the ground as attached to the ground or not? Right? Rabbi Eliezer would say, oh, we view it as attached to the ground, therefore part of the sale. And the rabbis would say, we view it as not attached to the ground and therefore not part of the sale. No. You could say that their whole thing is all about just sales. What does sales include? Are we saying, I sold to you generously, meaning then therefore we'll include more things, even things that were not attached to the ground, but because they're now attached to the ground, just say that was part of the sale. Or that's Rabbi Eliezer. Or the rabbis say, mocher ba'ayin ra'a mocher. No, you don't sell everything. You sell as little as possible. And therefore, it's not included. We're going to we're going to stop the list earlier, draw the line earlier. And perhaps that's the machloka, and it has nothing to do with this topic of mikveh and whether we view this as a utensil or not. So they reject that. Now we're going to move on to the second, and we'll end in the middle because the daf ends there. But Ella Rabbi Eliezer de kaveret volim. By the way, this will also be rejected. But when it comes to a beehive, now we're talking about, according to the Rashbam, it's a beehive that was attached to the ground. It was cemented into the ground. Okay. So again, it was something separate, movable. It became not movable because it's attached to the ground. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, we're going to have all sorts of relevant halachot about this. According to Rabbi Eliezer, he's going to view this as being attached to the ground. And then we're going to say, oh, well, that obviously then must be the Rabbi Eliezer that disagrees with the Tosefta, because the Tosefta said that won't work for mikvah because it was originally a vessel. And we don't view it as attached to the ground, whereas Rabbi Eliezer does. So for what does he view it as attached to the ground? We'll start with the first two because that's on our daf, and we'll leave the rest for tomorrow. Rabbi Eliezer says, Harehi kikarka. We view this like land, and the Rashbam adds, what does that mean? So it means it is acquired in the ways that land is acquired, kesef, shtar, chazakah, as we've learned before. It means that you could do a kinyan agav, if you remember. I can buy metaltalin with land. So if I buy land and metaltalin and I do a chazakah on the land, like I work the land or I do something with this, let's say this beehive, I can, through that one action, acquire all these other movable property that was part of the deal. So we view it like land. Kotvina leha pruzbal. If you remember, we learned about pruzbal, which is a way to avoid the cancellation of loans on the Shemitah year. So you can only write a prusbal if the borrower has land in their possession. It only works. But what if they have a kaveret volim? They have a beehive that's attached to the ground. That's enough to consider them landowners, even if they don't have other land in their possession. And then you can write a prusbal document with that borrower. So again, we're going to see a few other halachot that basically are going to show that Rabbi Eliezer views this as land, and they're going to then suggest, second suggestion, this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer that they're referring to, that views these vessels as land and that disagrees with the Tosefta about mikvah. But again, we're going to reject it, and that we'll all see tomorrow. So let's go back and review our daf. We started with Rav and Shmuel have a disagreement who we hold by. Rav Nachman and Rav Huna also disagree about who we hold by. We brought in this other machloka, Rav and Shmuel, about brothers who divide Yerusha, who we thought was exactly the same thing. In the end, it really is the same, but you couldn't have really learned one from the other, and that's why they argue in both cases. And then we had that side thing about Rav Huna basically giving in to Rav Nachman's opinion, even though he didn't agree with him. And then we had the last case there was the two houses that I sold, right? Two houses, one to different people. And we said, sale, gift, it doesn't matter. If two people got it, they're basically equal. There's no reason I would give more preference of one to the other. The whole mocher b'ayim yafa ra'ah is not relevant. And therefore, nobody has a path and access route. However, we did in the end conclude, though, if the gift was given to the one who the question is, do they have access to get through the other? And the other one was a sale, then the one who got the gift, we assume I did give more generously with the gift, and therefore the gift will go the one with the gift. If it means, did they get an access route through the sale person, then yes, they would. From there, we went to a new Mishnah about other things that are included. And now we weren't talking about things that are really not considered a house at all, but parts of the house that serve the house, that are needed for the house. But yet some of them are included, some of them are not. The Mishnah seemed to differentiate between things that are attached to the ground, things that are not attached to the ground. We saw in the Braita, though, that there was a distinction between things that from the start were attached to the ground versus things that were movable and then attached to the ground. And therefore, things that were movable and then attached to the ground are not considered part of the sale, whereas the other are. And just before that, we showed that the Mishnah doesn't match Rabbi Meir, who thinks anything that serves the vineyard would be included in the sale and therefore presumably in the house as well. And we disagree. So we have two disagreements of Tanaim really with our Mishnah. One about, sort of Rabbi Meir includes everything. And the other is that the Tanakama of the Braita actually excludes more things and says if it was originally movable and then attached, that's not going to be included in the sale. And then we brought up this mikvah case, the Tosefta mikvaot, and with this statement of the Gemara or somebody that said this does not match Rabbi Eliezer, it does not match the rabbis, and now we're in the process of figuring out which opinion of Rabbi Eliezer are we talking about. We thought it was the one from the Braita, but turns out it's not, and therefore we're still left with the question. With that, we'll finish for today, and have a great day, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow.